Welcome to Overcoming New Challenges, Exploring Possibilities. My name is Gabriel Díaz Maggioli, and I'm the academic advisor for the Center for the Advancement of Higher Education, and also coordinator of the postgraduate diploma in English language teaching at Universidad del Uruguay. It's a great pleasure to welcome you all to this professional development event, where we're going to be looking at what challenges the new normal, the new normal can pose for us teachers, and explore a few possibilities. I want to thank you all for coming, and we are going to spend together about an hour. We're going to have 3 short presentations, after which we will open up the floor for questions and answers from the audience. A few housekeeping rules to start with. Please do not use the chat until I tell you to do so to pose the questions. Basically, if you have any questions, they can be addressed at the end. And we hope that you enjoy what we have to share with you. And let me now introduce some of the colleagues who accompany me today. We have Marina Gonzalez joining us from Buenos Aires. Marina is one of the professors in our postgraduate diploma. She specializes in materials development. And Nicolas Dantas, who's also there, I can see him now, who's another faculty member in our program, and he is in charge of methodology and didactics. So without further ado, let's get us started a little bit with this event. Before I yield the floor to Nico, let me tell you what we consider would be 3 powerful topics to address in very short time. I know we are all busy, we are all juggling a whole host of responsibilities these days. But if anything has transpired over the past couple of weeks, is that now that we are back, at least in our country, in Uruguay, to full face-to-face teaching, what we consider was going to be back to normal is far from it. We are faced with a lot of contextual situations that we need to navigate. So what we have been doing, what we did during the pandemic, better said, which was basically solving problems of practice, has not stopped. We are still doing that. And we thought that there were 3 areas that the new reality we're facing could help us with possibilities. The first area, and Nico is going to be in charge of that, is communication, communicating with our students. The other area, which is very important, at least for language teachers in particular, is materials that we use for teaching and learning. And the last one that I need to emphasize a little bit is assessment. So those are going to be our 3 through threads for this event today. And without further ado, I'm going to stop sharing the screen and yielding over to Professor Dantas.
Thank you, Gabe. Hi, everyone. It's really nice to see all of you. My focus of research, my area is communication. And I'm in charge of methodology and didactics in our diploma. And today, what I want to discuss with you is this big question, that is why making communication happen is challenging in the classroom. Many times I met colleagues and students, and they are always asking, how can I make students communicate, or how can I help them communicate? And I think the basic answer to that question is that there is a simple misunderstanding as to what communication really is. Based on my research, we still haven't fully grasped a sound understanding of what communication is. So we may have an idea, we may have a notion of what it is, but when we have to implement it or when we have to execute it, we just don't do it the right way, or theories and praxis clash. It's like, things should be done in one way, but your practice is leading you towards something totally different. And this kind of dichotomy, this Frankenstein, as I would call, starts taking place in the classroom, in which we preach something, but we practice something that is totally different. And during this presentation, which, as Gabriel said, I only have 15 minutes for this, I will just give you some taste of what you would be discussing with me in my course. I will be focusing strongly on communication, but considering all modern approaches and everything that has revolutionized ELT during the 21st century. But today I just wanted to show you how actually all this started many years ago, and there are many things that you might have to remember. So today will be some hints, some bells I'll try to ring so that we can start this thinking process. And in order to understand communication, we need to understand the types or the kinds of communication that exist, of course. When we think about communication, many people immediately start thinking about speaking. And there is an undeniable instant connection that communication means speaking. So teachers come and tell me, well, I let my students speak a lot in the classroom, or I make them speak a lot in the classroom. But is that just communication only? Is that what we mean by being able to communicate? We need to understand that there is what we know as verbal communication, and that just not only happen in the spoken form, it also happens in the written form, which is an area that we must consider. And then there is this other form of communication, which is the non-verbal. And this is a very important one, because the idea of intercultural communicative competence, for example, also plays a major role. And if we really want to be communicative competent, we also need to understand how gestures, body movement, its facial expressions, all that carries meaning, and how that comes across with whoever I'm speaking or interacting with. So when we think about communication, as I said, we need to try to fully understand and do away with this misunderstanding that communication is only speaking. A lot has been written about communication, as I said, and I think it's always very important to go back to the basics. And back in 1971, Delheims dare contradict Chomsky with his paper on communicative competence. And he started discussing this idea of communication and language for communication. Now, all that sounded really good, and it started revolutionizing the field of linguistics, especially social linguistics in his case. But it wasn't until 1981 that we have the first book on communicative language teaching by William Littlewood. Why am I mentioning this? I'm not going to get into this at this point in depth, but of course, this is something that we need to know. But it's because if we think carefully, 51 years have gone by since we are talking about communication, and it's still a matter of discussion. It's still something that is difficult to grasp. It's still something that is misunderstood. So my invitation with this presentation today is to grasp a general understanding of what communication is, give you some tips on how to foster communication in your classroom, or what you can do to make communication happen in your classroom in an effective way, of course. But most importantly, to give you some food for thought and to start thinking what else is out there. When the revolution for communicative for communication started in the field of ELT, that was known as the strong form of ELT. And basically, yes, when that started, it was all about fluency, fluency, fluency. And no doubt that people would associate communication with speaking, because it was all about being fluent. It was all about no grammar. It was all about doesn't matter if the student is inaccurate. The important thing is that whoever's learning the language becomes fluent. So as one of my most favorite authors among the many that we have in the field of ELT, Mr. Scott Thornberry would say, those were the days in which teachers would become grammar dealers, probably, okay? Like, without now anybody seeing them, they would just be writing some grammar rule or every now and then to help students communicate a bit more, because at the end of the day, grammar is part of the language. And if we want to communicate, we need to know the language. And Howard, when he discusses the history of ELT in 1984, he publishes this comparison between the weak and the strong and the weak form of CLT. And it's in the weak form of CLT in which we understand that, yes, of course, fluency is important, but there are more things that have to do with communication other than just fluency. In order for you to be communicative competent, you need to also make sure that you use the language with a clear purpose, that you know the structure of the language, that you work with the lexis, you work with the skills. And it was then that a more profound, if I may say, understanding of how CLT could be implemented took place. So that's in a nutshell, huge nutshell, and excuse me for being so general, but I only have 15 minutes, as I said, is how the revolution for communication took place. Now, how do we consider all this in the classroom? First tip, think your classroom objectives from a functional perspective. We cannot say that we are promoting or fostering communication in the classroom if we don't see the language from a functional perspective, if we don't think the language functionally. These are all examples of lessons objectives I've been reading here and there. And I don't want to say they are really bad, all of them, though some may be. But if we notice is that none of them consider the aspect of the functionality of the language. If you're communicative competent, you are able to function with the language. In some of these objectives, we can see some degree of performance, but we don't describe the performance in terms of functionality, okay? And we need to remember that whenever we think of a lesson objective, we need to think it from a functional perspective. So by the end of this lesson, our students are going to be able to describe, to compare, to analyze, to defend, to persuade, to contrast. You mention it, but the important thing is that once you have that functionality, which will describe some or will show some performance, students will be able to start visualizing their output. Students will be able to understand the performance. That will be, of course, then measurable and would be fantastic for the assessment and all that, but I'm not going to get there. But students will be able to know how to use the language. They will not just know the language, they will know how to use it and what to use it for. So that's one tip. The other tip I want to give you today is make meaning clear. Nobody can communicate if meaning is not there. And for this, look, I'm citing Gategno here, Caleb Gategno, Silent Way, back 1963. And he reminded us even then of the importance of meaning. Now, when we communicate, we need to convey meaning. So, and we need to make sure that everything we say, everything we do, and even when we are teaching, our meaning, our purposes, our intentions are clear. So that's another piece of advice. I think I'm doing very good with my timing. Same line of thought, something that we shouldn't forget from the history of methodology is the idea of teacher silence, okay? You might remember the idea of subordinating your teaching to learning from Gategnos. And the less you can speak, the more opportunities you're giving students to communicate, to speak. So reduce your teacher talking time to its maximum. Easily said, not that easily done. And when we observe lessons, and when if you are a school coordinator, for example, you might see this at many times. How many opportunities a teacher missed to let the students speak? How many times the teacher increased his or her teaching talking time, etc., etc. How many times the teacher said more than what actually the student said. So evoke your teacher's silence, okay? Before you want to say something, as my friend Gabriel here always would tell me, count your Mississippis, okay? And don't start speaking. Back from even that revolution of the communicative approach, we had such a period, we had the idea of peripheral learning. This idea of posters, okay, with functional language in the classroom, okay, in my opinion, functional language, such as it was for other purposes. But the idea of posters is not just for simple decoration. It's because this idea of peripheral learning does exist. And in my research, using posters and evoking teacher silence can increase students' interaction in the classroom by more than 200%. Simply by implementing these two strategies in less than 5 weeks of classroom instruction. So select your functions, make posters, evoke your teacher's silence, and enhance students' peripheral learning and get them speaking. And last but not least, let's not remember that words never take place in isolation. Nobody speaks with words in isolation. Words in isolation only take place in the dictionary. So don't teach words in isolation. Whenever you're working with lexis, never do that. If you want students to communicate, lexis is a must. It's not grammar. I mean, grammar is important, but lexis is a must. So instead of just writing tree, if you're teaching tree on the board, write a tree or 2 trees. Start from day one, from the very beginning, helping students understand that there is something that is called lexical chunk, that words never happen in isolation, and that there are collocations that are natural. So instead of just writing water, if you're teaching water, write some water or a glass of water, but never get them into the habit of speaking or using the language with words in isolation, because that's not real communication. And with that, my 15 minutes are done. I thank you a lot. And this was just the headline of communication. More to be said, considering the 21st century.
Thank you very much, Nico. Wonderful bibliography, wonderful presentation. Please hold your questions until we finish. I hope there are many questions. It was a very interesting presentation. Moving on, I would like to introduce our colleague, Marina Gonzalez. Marina, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. This is part of the interesting things that we all cover different fields within ELT, and some of them are filled with theory and some others are not. This is my case. I mean, most of the work and materials is quite recent, and it is an area that has originally been shaped by the practices of teachers. All right. In general, originally authors were teachers who tended to have a certain strategy, whatever, and they followed what was planned appropriately. So my presentation for today, which is basically following the idea of Encanto's main song, all right, as we don't talk about Bruno. Well, I was thinking about why talk about materials. Why is it a topic that has been appearing now for some time now? It's always related or somehow mentioned in the different exchanges among teachers, most of the times in terms of complaints or desires. And what I wanted to do today was not give you tips, but just ask questions and start asking questions and more questions. So the first thing, when we start thinking about why talk about materials, we think about this idea of, well, but materials for whom? In what circumstances? For what audiences? With what elements that can be used or not? In what contexts, right? And immediately we come to the idea that when we talk about materials, we start to keep on thinking more questions. Are we talking about materials? Are materials the same as resources? Are booklets materials or resources? What about photocopies? Who are the authors of those photocopies? Is it important at all to consider who may have produced those photocopies, in what context, in what situations? And what about on how do photocopies work? In what way are they different from worksheets? But nowadays, and mostly affected by what the COVID situation in all of us, and this relation with technology, we start including other elements as part of our materials, and this is Padlets, right? So would we consider Padlets as materials? What about slides? Are slides materials? Are they resources? Are they? And what about games? And what kind of games are we? When we talk about games, are we talking about games especially designed for the teaching of a language? Are we talking about using games that were originally created for another topic to be used in our area? What about Minecraft, right? I mean, everybody has been. Now, would it be the same for me to use Minecraft with a child than with a teenager than with an adult? Apps. Are apps materials? Are apps to learn languages in isolation, individually? Can they be included in what I'm going to use in my classes? Are they part of my repertoire? Sometimes I feel that I'm a little bit too technical in certain definitions, and I'm ready to discuss this, and I hope that I will meet some of you and we will be able to discuss. But in general, from all of these questions, there is one key difference between materials and resources. In general, materials are resources that have been used for teaching, okay, that have some intervention for specific teaching, okay. This is the only thing that I'm going to tell you about the technicalities of the field, okay. But the big question here, and I hope that you are with me on this, is whether the same rules apply to all. If we are talking about printed material or a game, depending on the physicality of the game, if we're talking about an app, do we apply always the same rules? So, moving a step forward in terms of questioning, there is something that we also need to question, is the distance between you and the realities in books, okay? That is when I get, because suppose that this variety of materials, worksheets, etc., is somehow solved to say, okay, I have a book, brilliant. Now, what about the distance of your reality and the realities in books? Okay, as I was mentioning, focusing specifically on the Uruguayan reality, okay, we are there on the other side of the river, okay, but we are here. And the realities depicted are mostly from the Northern Hemisphere. Some exotic points are generally depicted based on some reasons related to audiences that buy books, or representation of some conception of diversity. But from the very beginning, we have one big problem, that is the seasons don't fit. Okay, so how satisfied may I be with something in that sense? And is it good? I mean, then do I need, or am I happy with the reality that I have in those books, or do I want to change anything? So, moving on with more questions, all right? We can also think of, suppose that teachers are not satisfied with materials, with printed materials, with commercial materials. So they start becoming independent and they start searching materials. And what are the routes that they tend to follow, right? They follow the magic phrase, which is free PDF, right? Or free download. And then, again, the question, do the same rules apply to all? A free PDF or a free download of something, is it the same? Is it from any website? Is it from anywhere in the world? Is it enough? And when we try this phrase on the web, what do we find? We find grammar worksheets, all right? Loads, grammar galore, okay? Now, was that what you wanted? Because if we take a very quick look at what Google search brings, you have, first of all, it's so wide, the possibilities that they offer, that they are subdivided into grade, preschool, fourth grade, pre-K, kindergarten, and if you take a look, all right, you have lots of things that are related to children. We may think of things that Nico mentioned a couple of minutes ago, that is, the words are words, but many of them are not in chunks. There are some things that are interesting that are somehow related to mathematics, but is the way mathematics is the way mathematics is portrayed here, is it similar to the choices of my jurisdiction, of my country, in terms of teaching? Are we talking about mathematical operations, or are we talking about sequencing? Are we talking about things related to the organization of language, or what? So, moving on, I want to bring you the only tip that I want to share with you. And this is work by Bower in 2015. And it is a typology of free web-based learning technologies. All right. This is an organization. Whenever we talk about materials, about going to the web, searching for things, obtaining materials, what happens? We talk about the names of products, but not the category of the product. And this is what this wonderful typology brings, all right? That is categorizing things on whether, and it's interesting to see that we can see how this was 2015 because web conferencing tools is at the top and it's not developed. And now after the pandemic, we can really develop it much further, okay? But you have text-based tools, image-based tools, audio tools, video tools, multimodal production, digital storytelling, website creation, all right? And all these have a sense, they make meaning, and they have a purpose. There is a reason, there is a category, internal categories within each of them. So what I would like to invite you to share, and to discuss is what the rationale, what principles we want to follow if we decide to create materials. Maybe if I'm producing materials for myself, just having simply a worksheet is enough because it's me, my class, and my and the materials that I have developed. So whatever is not present in the materials, I can solve it with my body and my presence and my bond with my students. But what happens if I want to produce materials for somebody else? This really changes. And these are things that I would love to be able to discuss more in detail and to produce together during the course that we are going to share. Okay, so the last thing that I'm going to share with you is again is not a tip, is a process, is an organization of the mind, all right? That is, when you design materials, people tend to think that they just write, they make a copy, or they print it and it's out. And materials design takes a lot of time, and a big part of the time is devoted to thinking. And first, you have to choose a topic, an area, right? Then you have to design a work plan. You don't start writing before you have designed. Then you gather resources. After having all those three together, you draft. We tend to think that after the draft, we're all satisfied and we're happy, and that's not true. Have to test it, and the test, it will probably be wrong or will probably show elements that can be improved. So then you adjust and redraft, okay? And with this, I'm just going to say goodbye, all right, for today. I hope to meet you again and be able to work together in this specific field of materials design. Thank you.
Trying to put things together. If you've ever attended any of my talks, I usually use a photograph, an illustration that I downloaded from the New York Times in 2018, which is this one, that somehow shows the reality of the classroom, okay? If you look at it, you see different kids with different attitudes, some of them duly doing their work, others playing, others completely distracted, bored, etc. And we thought that this was a problem of the face-to-face lesson. Now, during the pandemic, we all expressed concerns about the students not switching on their cameras, for example. And very little is known about why students do that. At ORT, we undertook an extensive piece of research on the potentials and the advantages and disadvantages of using hybrid learning, where we have some students present and some at a distance. And when we asked students, we surveyed 848 students, if I'm no, 864 students. And one thing that became clear when we asked them about why don't you switch off the camera, there were three main things. And two have to do with procedural things. One is the teacher doesn't ask me to switch on my camera because we're kind of afraid, right, to impinge on their privacy and things of the sort. The other was peer pressure. Nobody switches it on. I don't want to be the only one whose face is right there. But the overwhelming answer, the reason for not switching the camera was I feel anxious, I feel overexposed, I'm shy, or I am ashamed to see my face on screen. And that brought us to focus a lot on students' well-being, right? And students' well-being and mental health, which has been a challenge. We've started classes in Uruguay very recently, but I have already been going around different high schools and hearing the story of the number of students who are experiencing emotional distress has brought me to consider that we need to do something about it, because there's something broken in education. There's something broken at all levels. There is something broken in the level of classroom practice. There's something broken at the level of educational administration. There is something broken at the level of how I, as a teacher, can fulfill my mission, but at the same time survive the conditions in which I have to work. We are all experiencing huge difficulties and challenges in that sense. And what I thought I would do is do this. Do you think that this equation is correct or not? What do you think? You can use the chat for this if you want. Is this a correct equation? Okay, I have an answer. Nope. Well, what if I were to tell you that, yeah, it's a correct equation? Now, it depends on how we look at it, in the same way that what we are going through depends on how we look at it. Because if I have one piece of bread, and you have one piece of bread, and we exchange each piece of bread, we still have one piece of bread each. Now, if I have an idea and you have an idea, we both have three ideas, right? Not one. So this is what I want to convey with you. I'm going to go to tips, right? The tips that I have used during the pandemic and in hybrid teaching and learning, because I've already started teaching in a hybrid fashion this year. And these are very practical, common sense ideas that I hope you can translate to your classrooms and start applying. And they don't have anything to do with technology. They have to do with sound pedagogy, with the students' mental, physical, and emotional well-being at the center. The first one is we are all concerned with what the students didn't learn during the pandemic. And so the natural tendency that I see many colleagues take is, oh my God, I have to cover what they didn't do 2 years ago, what they did last year, and what they need to learn this year. They will never be up to standards. Well, that is not quite true. We teachers tend to look at the content as the vehicle for student learning. And if you connect this with Nicolas's talk, right? He explained to us that if we think in terms of functional language use, and if we create achievable learning outcomes, we can overcome the problems that they have. So one good habit of mind that I would like to start practicing is do not focus on what students don't know. Focus on what you have to teach them next week. And just think for a minute, what are the prerequisites for them to learn that? So say, for example, you want to encourage, one of the things you need to do is you need to get the students to read a reading selection from the materials you are using, from an authentic source, etc. And you say, oh my God, they don't even know the names of the colors. So focus on the thing you have to teach them and prepare them. Do a kind of scaffold that we call bridging. What does bridging mean? Basically that, providing them with the resources, linguistic, intellectual, cognitive, that they need to be able to do what you want them to do. And you will see that if you think in this way, slowly what they haven't learned will not matter anymore, because you're focusing on the future. You're not focusing on the past. I know we all feel like this guy in the picture. Oh my God, how am I going to do this? Well, my advice is take it one step at a time. Go small. Focus on what we can call micro-learning. Don't try to teach them the whole thing we used to teach, because you know what? The rhythm of our lessons has changed. We have to redefine pacing, right? And the rhythm of the lesson, because virtuality has forced us to do things in a different way. And students now, if we want them to really learn, we need to give them the pacing that they need. One of the complaints that our distance learning students had in terms of attending a hybrid class, for example, was that the teacher flies through the lesson. And that's normal. We want to cover things that we didn't used to be able to, right? But taking that idea instead, okay? Focus on the pacing of the lesson. It doesn't mean your lessons have to drag on and be boring, but be realistic about what can be achieved in the span of time that you have available, right? And just focus on what students need to be able to do. Craft very well-written learning outcomes and communicate them to the students. More on that later. Second thing is the pandemic has left us, one of the things that is broken is the pandemic has left us with a lot of challenges. To me, I would summarize challenges in two. The first one is what I call the fake gurus. If you think back to the early months of 2020, there was a plethora of professional development offers from these supposed to be gurus of technology enhanced instruction. And a lot of the material is still online through YouTube or even in Facebook, Instagram, etc. Now, my criticism about those gurus is that they use the pandemic as a platform for personal promotion. And if we look at who the people are, they have never taught online or with technology before. The only thing they did was to jump in the bandwagon. So if you look at us, I invite you to do this exercise. Select 5 or 6 webinars, and everything you will hear is you can use this app, or you can use this app, or you can use this app, or you can use this app, without regard to what learning does this app promote. And most of the apps that were promoted are what Leslie Painter and I call drag and drop apps, where you don't really need to be cognitively engaged. You just have to drag and drop, tick. And we know that that is not the kind of learning that students expect, right? And this brings me down to Marina's presentation about the rigor that has to be imbued in the creation of any resource. And there are 2 things that I would like to emphasize about her presentation. One is this: there has to be a plan on how to develop the materials. The other one is the ready availability of the magic phrase of free PDF download. And the problem with these vast collections of resources, online resources, is that they are not curated. They are just uploaded without any kind of filter. And you find horrible things there. And in the zest to provide a quick fix, to give a practice activity, we download them and give them to the students, and we're doing more harm than benefit. So one thing that I want to stress here is that diversity, the diversity in the classroom is nowadays more ever present, because on top of all the kind of diversity that we have the emotional diversity of the students' emotional needs. And that is the linchpin. We know that unless they are emotionally sound or they are emotionally stable, they cannot learn. I'm not talking about the affective filter here. This is not a construct that I adhere to. I do adhere to the fact that the affective influences the cognitive in the same way that the cognitive influences the affective. So a few ideas. What I'm going to share with you is something that I did last year with my own students. I basically structure my lessons from the point of view of safety. What my students bring to the learning encounter is an expectation to learn something, but they also have a lot of anxieties. So how do I lower my students' anxieties and help them focus on what we do? Well, the first thing we do is we have a do now activity, right? This is from a didactics class I taught last year, as you can see, June the 8th, 2021. And the topic was structuring a language lesson. This is what the syllabus told me I had to teach. So we started every class with a do now activity. And I do this on site and online and in hybrid environments. What is that? A way for students to focus on something that they can contribute from the very beginning to the lesson. Then I share with them the learning outcome for the day, so they know exactly what they should be able to do at the end of the lesson. And this is not just because I want to double check that they can do it. I want them to self-assess how close or how far away from the learning outcome they are after participating in the lesson, in whatever category they do it, whether they are active participants, semi-active, or passive participants. The learning outcome gives us a north, a destination, and they can see how far or how close to that destination they have reached, getting given their involvement in the lesson. I'm trying to hurry up because it's almost time. I have 1 minute left. And then I share with them the agenda for the day. Many people say this is boring, this doesn't work. Nick Peachy, for example, has a wonderful blog post against doing everything I'm telling you to do. And I think that he had a point before the pandemic. But nowadays, I find that if my students have this clearly stated from the beginning, there are no anxieties. They know that they are going to do a reflective activity. They know that they are going to do a jigsaw activity in breakout rooms. They know that I'm going to give them a mini lecture, and perhaps there they can switch off the cameras and, I don't know, make themselves a coffee, or the things that we do when we switch off our cameras. And then when we have individual work followed by teamwork, so they know there are no big questions about this. And what this gives me is also a tool so that at the end of the lesson, I can go back to both the learning outcome and the agenda and involve them in thinking about what are the takeaways of today's lesson. What are you taking away from today's lesson? Here, the issue of communication that Nicolas brought to bear becomes paramount, because clear, unambiguous, meaningful communication lies at the basis of everything we do. When I do the learning outcome, I explain to them not just the learning outcome, but why we are learning this. What is the purpose of learning this? So if you, for example, have to teach a grammar lesson and your students hate grammar, you have to explain to them that by becoming aware of how a certain structure works, they will be able to participate in a conversation, et cetera, et cetera. But the worst thing you can do is to say, today we're going to learn something new. And here, the issue is consistency, fairness, and learning. And feedback, the feedback that we give the students is fundamental. Now, any kind of feedback that we give to students will help them somehow learn. However, there's only one quality of feedback that will promote uptake of that feedback. So if we tell them things like, for example, you got a 10, and the students don't know what a 10 means, or you did well, but the student's perception of the performance is not aligned with that, then the whole issue of learning falls through. Anxiety stems from evaluation. We have to look for ways of assessing learners about the things they can do and not about the things they cannot do. And over the years, I have developed this little tool, which I call Show That You Care. Some of you may have seen this in my presentations because this is something that I developed as a teacher, as materials for me to teach better, right? And it's basically an acronym that helps me whenever I give feedback to students, orally or written. It helps me bear in mind the student and his or her learning process. What does care mean? Well, basically, it starts by clarifying. When you're giving feedback to students, if you have areas that were not clear to you, ask them questions. Probe to see if they did it out of habit or they actually did it because they were engaged in it, right? Secondly, this is basically for students, teachers, right? But this can apply to students. The second part of the feedback is to appreciate. Appreciate what? Tell them everything they did well and do that. Force yourself to look at the appreciation of a student's work because as Paulo De Nagy says, feedback is the reward that students expect for their work. So it's our responsibility to provide that reward. And after you tell them everything they've done beautifully, then engage them in reflecting. Tell them everything they did wrong and ask them, what do you think you can improve from this? Don't aim at them improving everything because it's impossible, right? But what can they improve? Last but not least, empower the students. And how do we empower? By focusing on 2 or 3 things that the student can improve, not focusing on things they won't be able to improve. And if they cannot come up with ideas on how to improve them, we give them to them, okay? These 3 simple tools, think about what the student needs to learn this week and bridge the gap, the bridging scaffold. Then making your classes, what do you call, not predictable, but safe, okay? Where all the big questions are answered ahead of time. And then providing ongoing feedback. You will see that slowly the learning is enhanced.